it is the case that the Johannine Gospel is actually the toughest one to date. The Johannine wave, you know, that's the one that's hardest to surf. But I'm going to give you my best today. I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can tell me what you think. This is just like any old graduate seminar that I would give to anybody, and you guys are teaching me as much as I am you. I mean, we could have dealt with John or the Johannine wave first. You know, it's just that I don't know, this is how it ended up. But I don't want to give any sense of necessity here. Um, as always, I'd like to start with the internal evidence, okay? So with regard to what's inside of it, you know, that's the best evidence. It's typically the best evidence because when you think about it, most of the external evidence is really nothing more than church legend. So we will get to that. That's sort of like the insider discourse. But for the moment, we just want to figure out, you know, what is actually plausible from the text itself. So let's look at John 5:2. Now, the reason why I start with John 5:2 is actually our friend Jonathan Bernier, who wrote the most recent book on rethinking the dates of the New Testament. This is really where he places most of the weight of his own timing for John. And he places the Gospel of John between 60 and 70 of the Common Era, which is very, very low. There's a middle dating, which is around 100, and then late datings have gone up to 170. So, in fact, there's a very, very famous person who suggested that John was 170, and that's F.C. Bauer. If any of you know him, he's a tremendous scholar coming out of Germany, died the same year that the American Civil War began, 1860. And he said that the Gospel of John was written in 170. And the conservatives have been fighting him ever since. But what are the kind of evidence, or what's the kind of evidence that is being used to determine the date of John? Well, believe it or not, for Bernier, it comes down to the sheep pool. And so if you read in John 5:2, you'll notice that the text uses the present tense, saying that there is in Jerusalem a pool, and the pool has 5 porticos or porches. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that these porticos and the pool still exist, right? Because you can tell a story in the present tense without making any sort of claim about external reality. And there's lots of reasons to use the present tense, right? You can use it to be vivid, or you can use it to, you know, as we say, the historic present, that everyone knows you're talking about the past, but as you're giving the narration itself, you're using the present tense. And that tends to make it a little bit more active for the reader. Okay. Now, again, but the conservative argument and Bernier's argument is that if he uses the present tense, then this pool is still in existence and the porticos are still in existence. And Bernier assumes that the pool and the porticos would have been destroyed in the summer of 70 when the city was captured by the Romans. Therefore, John must be prior to 70. The reason why I don't think this is convincing also is not only for literary reasons, that this is just a historic present, but also for historical reasons and archaeological reasons. There's a text that is ascribed to this pilgrim from Bordeaux, and it's 4th century, so 333 of the Common Era. And this pilgrim also speaks of the very same pool, which has 5 porticos, using the Latin here, quinque porticos habendes. And the pool is still there in 333. Now, I mean, I take it to heart that the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. And if you read Josephus, he does say that certainly most of the walls were destroyed. Any kind of military installation was destroyed. That most of the towers were destroyed. And probably a good number of the buildings. But it's interesting that when Bernier and others make this sort of argument, they actually aren't able to point to direct evidence from Josephus or anyone else that this specific pool was destroyed. And that's actually kind of important because, to my mind, I don't think it is proved that the pool was destroyed. I don't think that, it was necessarily preserved pristine in its pristine state either, but I don't think there was any reason for the Roman army to fill in what seemed to have been very large pools. And it's interesting. The other interesting thing about this particular pool is that this pool with healing properties was known to still be active in the city of Aelia Capitolina, which is Hadrian's refounding of Jerusalem. Okay, so that's interesting. And I think one could even make the argument that we don't, outside of the Gospel of John, we don't have any indication that in Jesus's time period, this pool was associated with healing. But we do know that this particular pool was associated with healing in Aelia Capitolina. And because we know that from archaeology that this was the site of an Asclepius Serapis cult, a healing cult, one could hypothesize that actually we would need to say that the association of this particular site with healing is a post-Aelia Capitolina development. Now, again, that's not a smoking gun, right? That's not a smoking gun because it's simply, a lack of evidence prior to Aelia Capitolina that we have for this being a site of healing. But since we know this was a site of healing associated with Asclepius and Serapis after 135, then we might actually think that far from being before 70, this story actually attests a time after 135 when this site was associated with healing. There's another passage that I think is fairly important, and it's also one I gave on the challenge, where Jesus, in the final chapter, some people think it's an appendix, but in the final chapter of the Johannine wave, verse 18, Jesus prophesies Peter's death, and he says that Peter will stretch out his hands and someone else will tie you or belt you. Could be either one. So, yeah, that's interesting because that's pretty specific. I mean, there is obviously a touch of vagueness in all of this, but when it comes to death prophecies, that is kind of specific. And so what does this author know? If you go to First Clement, it's interesting that in First Clement, the author knows that Peter's going to die, but he doesn't seem to know he's going to die by crucifixion. And I don't date First Clement to 95. I date First Clement to around 140. The Peter dying on a cross tradition, really the first attestation of that is in the Acts of Peter, and specifically the end of the Acts of Peter called the Martyrdom of Peter, chapter 38. And that's late 2nd century. And that's the tradition that Tertullian is familiar with in his book, Scorpion's Sting, where he says that Peter was bound around the body by another when he was bound to the cross. Now, I think it's fairly clear that Tertullian actually has the passage in John in mind when he's making this comment, and he's himself making the connection that Jesus's prophecy of Peter's death was accurate because it's about a crucifixion. And in this particular model of crucifixion, Peter was not nailed, but bound to the cross. And actually, that was a fairly common way to crucify victims as well. They didn't have to nail you. They could tie you as well. I mean, it had the same basic effect. Again, it's not a smoking gun, but whoever is writing that 21st chapter of John, and again, that seems to be an addition, it's part of the wave, the last part of the wave. Whoever was writing that probably knows that Peter was crucified. And if he knows that Peter is crucified, we can't date that tradition really any earlier than about 170. So I actually think this particular tradition actually confirms F.C. Baur's original thesis that John might be as late as 170, at least chapter 21, at least that instance of John, because I don't know how else he knows that Peter's crucified. Now, the other bit is the high priests, right? And this we get in John 11:49 and 18:13. And specifically, we've got two named high priests. Caiaphas is named twice, in 1149, we've got Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And then skipping to 1813, we have Jesus after his arrest. They took him to Annas, who was father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, again, that year. Now that's interesting, because if you do turn to Josephus in the Antiquities, he's actually very helpful here, because he mentions both Annas and Caiaphas, and he also gives you a sense for how long they reigned. So Annas is early, when Jesus was a kid, basically, and he reigns from 6 to 15. And then Caiaphas, who is the son-in-law of Annas, is high priest from 18 to 37. And that's also quite fascinating, because why does the author of John then say that Caiaphas, who we know reigned almost 20 years, why does he twice say that he was high priest that year? That's confusing. It's as if the author or editors of the Johannine Wave at this point, they don't really know much about the high priesthood. And for whatever reason, they assume that high priests are sort of like Roman consuls, that they only reign for a year. They only reign for a year. At least that's the impression that you would get from John. Now, why would someone have this impression? Well, if you go back and read Josephus in context, it's very interesting. So Josephus Antiquities 18.34 mentions a bunch of high priests. And here's what he says, just as an excerpt, quote, "A year later, the Roman governor Gratus deposed Ananus," that's another name for Annas, "and entrusted the office of high priest to Simon." And then, skipping a bit, Simon held this position of high priesthood for not more than a year, and he was succeeded by none other than Caiaphas. Now, I think this is interesting, because someone picking up Josephus in an excerpt, right, not reading in context, who otherwise has very little information about how the high priesthood worked in the Roman era, someone might read this passage and assume, number one, that Annas reigned 1 year. And then someone also might assume that because Simon, who's high priest, only held his position for about a year, that was also true of his successor, Caiaphas. Now, that would be a historical mistake, but if all you had was this excerpt from Josephus, you might think that. So again, this goes down to the question of, are the evangelists dependent on Josephus? Because it seems like, frankly, they are. And they need Josephus to get some political knowledge about how Judaism existed in Roman antiquity, because they're looking at it from a distance and they actually don't remember, or they never learned how it worked. So they need Josephus to tell them, but they're not the greatest readers of Josephus. So they actually make a historical mistake and don't even know it. If the authors or editors of John are reading Josephus, then they're not prior to 93. But let's look at external evidence. Okay, when is the very first attestation of the Johannine Wave that is recognizably Johannine text? Well, that appears to be in Justin Martyr. Now, some people dispute this, but I don't think that's probably right. Justin Martyr says, quote, unless you are born again, you will surely not enter the kingdom of the heavens. And he goes on, now that, this is from John 3, the dialogue with Nicodemus, and he makes this absolutely clear by this next comment. Now, that it's impossible for those who have been once born to enter into their mother's womb is manifest to all. This is recognizably Jesus's dialogue with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus asks whether he should climb back into his mother's womb. And Jesus has a little bit of fun with that. What's interesting about Justin is he never says that he's taking this from anything like a book called John. In fact, he doesn't do that with any of the Gospels. He doesn't read them as distinct books, apparently. And he doesn't find any need to cite them as distinct books. But my money is that he's got what to us is John 3. Now, you could argue that maybe he has it through oral tradition, but I don't put much stock in oral tradition. This is actually, the wording is very close. And why wouldn't that oral tradition exist prior? Why wouldn't it have earlier attestation? Maybe this is an independent tradition. Maybe John 3 is circulating separately. I mean, we don't know, but this is part of the wave. So when is Justin? Justin is writing the first apology around 155. So he's got some version of the Johannine wave in 155. Now, it's also the case that Ignatius, and by Ignatius I mean the middle recension of the 7 letters, probably he knows John too. I don't actually dispute that. But what I dispute are these conservatives who aren't up to date on the dating of Ignatius, which scholars increasingly date to the middle and even the late 2nd century. So I think a date range for the middle recension is actually 140 to 160. So yes, Ignatius knows the Johannine wave, but that doesn't mean that the Johannine wave is attested in the year 110 or whatever the earliest possible Eusebian date is. I don't think it holds any water. So then we get to Irenaeus. And Irenaeus, as is usual, he makes the story a lot more vivid. And he's got a full-blown legend about a guy named John who is an apostle and the beloved disciple. And he's living in Ephesus until the reign of Trajan, which is quite striking given that the average age of a person in antiquity is about 35. Now, that does take into account the high, rates of death at birth and infant mortality. So, if you remove that piece, then your average age maybe bounces up to 40 or 45. But for an apostle who knows Jesus to live until the year 98, that would be very surprising. I mean, this apostle would have to be very young when meeting Jesus. So let's say he's 20 in the year 30, and then you've got 70 years after that. So he would be 90 by the year 100. That's not impossible, but it's also not very likely. Now, what's interesting, and I went back and I read the Against Heresies. It's interesting that Irenaeus doesn't claim that Polycarp, who is a leader in Ephesus, he doesn't claim that Polycarp actually directly knew this Apostle John. And that's interesting because there seems to be confusion about the Johns in Ephesus. There seem to be multiple Johns because Papias refers to John the Elder, and Eusebius actually takes Irenaeus to task because he doesn't distinguish John the Elder from John the Apostle. So I actually don't doubt that there could have been a guy named John in Asia Minor around the year 100. But I would be very skeptical of a dogmatic and isolated claim that this is the apostle, the writer of John, and the one who, leaned over on his breast and was the beloved disciple. All of that is the claim, you could say, of the church, but it's actually Irenaeus's claim, which later gets popularized and developed much more. But it's a late claim, and it's a pretty isolated claim, at least at this time. around 185. All right, and then finally we've got Clement of Alexandria, who is writing shortly after Irenaeus, who says that John is a spiritual gospel, which means that it's after the synoptic gospels. And interestingly enough, it's not Clement directly whom we have here, but we have Eusebius quoting Clement. So you got to trust Eusebius for a lot of this. And it's actually from this tradition that we have the, this is the tradition that gives people the peace of mind to say John is the last of all the gospels. And actually, this tradition and this tradition alone has stood the test of time. So that even today, whether you're conservative or liberal or somewhere in the middle, most people today think that John was last. But if you believe in the wave model, you don't necessarily have to believe that. Not at all. I mean, you can have any number of confluences and interactions with John in an earlier form interacting with earlier forms of the other waves.